The Edwardian castles of North Wales. In the past few pages, many examples have been quoted from castles in Wales and the Marches. This is because almost constant warfare between Welsh and English in the 13th century led to much building of strongholds and development of fortifications. And it is to Wales that one must turn for the most perfect specimens in these islands of medieval fortifications. The castles built by Edward I after the Welsh campaigns of 1277 and 1282. The castles built by this king, of which there are substantial remains, are at Flint, Rhuddlan, or Rhuddlan, Flintshire, Conwy, Carnarvon, Beaumaris, Harlech, or Merioneth, Aberystwyth. In each case except Harlech, a fortified town was included in the original design. The walls of Conwy and Carnarvon are still practically intact, and the whole system, castle, town wall, and town plan of the former, is one of the finest of its kind in Europe. The perfection and magnificence of these examples of the work of the medieval engineer must be seen to be believed. They have high curtains, adequately flanked by towers. Usually round and mostly elaborately defended entrance. At Carnarvon and Conwy there is a single defended area divided into two by a cross wall, and Flint Castle has a peculiar plan for which there is no parallel of its date, 1277. But the other examples quoted are all built on concentric plan, e.g. Beaumaris, the inner ward of immense height, except now at Aberystwyth Castle, which is much ruined, has towers on the curtain and one or more gatehouses. Parallel with this wall, and as a rule only a few yards outside it, is another, the outer curtain, which also had towers flanking its line. This is always much lower than the inner curtain, as at Harlech and Rhuddlan. It is only a few feet high. The purpose of this was to enable the defenders of the inner curtain to fire over the heads of those on the outer curtain without hurting them. Quite often the towers of the outer curtain were left open at the back, in order that, if taken by an enemy, they'd be of little use to him, because their interior would be under fire from the inner curtain. The castles of Edward I in North Wales are the most celebrated of those of concentric type, but they are by no means the only examples. Other castles were assimilated to this style in the 13th century by the addition of an outer curtain. The Tower of London shows this system splendidly, as do Castle Rushen, Isle of Man, and Kirkcaldy Castle, Carmarthenshire, one of the finest of the many examples of castles of South Wales. But for elaboration of this system, where water was available for wide moats and lakes, and for intricate defences of the entrance, one must go to Caerphilly Castle in Glamorgan, which is rightly prized as the greatest castle in the British Isles. The erection of these masterpieces of fortification was the result of the wisdom and success of the great English king Edward I. His reign, 1272 to 1307, together with those of his son Edward II, 1307 to 27, and grandson Edward III, 1327 to 77, cover a complete century, during much of which the English were supreme at war throughout northwestern Europe. Wales was conquered, the Scots were overcome, although not conquered, and much of France was overrun and annexed. The expeditions which accomplished these feats had amongst them most of the warlike spirits of the land, who, whilst away to foreign wars, had little thought for private quarrels at home. Thus it came about that there was less need in the 14th century than there had been in the preceding 100 years for the private fortress called castle. Another feature of contemporary life tended in the same direction. Growth of trade went hand in hand with expansion of domain, and with it there grew up a class of traders, living in towns, who quickly made themselves as important as the nobles in the council of the realm. Their power was based on their wealth, which had of course to be stored in their towns. These therefore needed defences, and it is amongst town walls as much as amongst castles that 14th century fortifications can be seen. Some towns of course already had defences, but in many cases they were of earth and timber, except for a stone gateway, and in some they were incomplete. The town wall of York is almost complete, but is hardly typical, although it is most imposing with its turreted gates called bars. The wall of Great Yarmouth is entirely a work of the 14th century or later, and is very well preserved. In even better preservation, because more visible today, is the wall of Southampton, a product of 100 years' work from about 1260 onwards. The walls of Conwy and Carnarvon surrounding boroughs founded by Edward I when he built the adjacent castles are practically intact, and so is the less well-known wall of the town of Tenby in Pembrokeshire. The system is the same in almost all cases. There is a high wall, the face of which could everywhere be observed, and if necessary, defended from towers projecting at suitable intervals along its course. These towers are usually D-shaped and are hollow. Often they had no back wall and were in fact mere fighting platforms. Such a tower on the wall of Canterbury was once again fitted up for use in the original manner, i.e. with a movable wooden floor, in the year 1940. For these and other reasons, the domiciles of the nobles of England from now onwards tended to become less and less martial in appearance. It is not easy in certain cases to decide whether a building should be called a castle because of a few flank fortification, or whether one should rest content with the term defended house. It is not possible to define a line between the two, because at all times there were infinite gradations. Even if Northumberland, in the late 13th century, there existed an entirely undefended house, Iden Castle. Elsewhere in England there were many more. Many of them in these later centuries were enclosed within areas, rectangular and often square, defined by a wet moat. The grassy remains of their buildings, long since vanished, are to be seen in hundreds in eastern counties labelled moat on the US maps. They are poor relations of such a structure as Mostock Castle in Warwickshire, which is still inhabited. It is a square in a plan, it's surrounded by a moat, and was certainly capable of defence, but its prime purpose was of the comfort of its lord. Stokesay Castle, Shropshire, is an interesting case in point. Its owner, Lawrence Ludlow, received licence to crenellate on October 19th, 1290. This term means that he was entitled to put battlements on top of the walls. In other words, to fortify it, since without proper battlements, adequate defence would be difficult. Because of this licence, Stokesay is called and is looked upon as a castle, but in fact its only fortification is a strong tower next to the southern end of the hall. All the other buildings are of entirely domestic character. This, of course, is my castle book that I've had for a very long time, and it's not a book you will find easy to track down. It's published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office in 1954, and it is written by B.H. St. Jean O'Neill, formerly Chief Inspector of Ancient Monuments of England and Wales. Now, why am I discussing this at the beginning of Harlech? Well, one of the interesting things that always interested me when I was looking at the castles was that this has a chapter called Some Castles of Special Interest, beginning on page 27. And it lists them out. And specifically, it lists Aberystwyth, Beaumaris, Carnarvon, Caerphilly, Conwy, Denbigh, Flint, Harlech, Hawarden, Kidwelly, Rhuddlan, and Ruthven. Rhuddlan or Ruthven. Now, Harlech always sort of appealed to me. Possibly it was the singing of Men of Harlech, which is dedicated to one of its sieges in, well, actually, I think during the English, during the War of the Free Kingdoms, as it's sometimes called, or the English Civil War, when people try and pretend that Scotland and Ireland were involved in it somehow. They were. But what interested me was this was listed, it was starred, it was obviously special, it was talked about, and yet, when I looked through the plans, it wasn't in them. Beaumaris is, Carnarvon is. But Harlech isn't. That Carnarvon gets in twice. So why not Harlech? And then, showing my age, a couple of years later, I was introduced to the internet. And I'd been to Wales, but I hadn't seen Harlech Castle. My family went spent all the time going around steam trains. And I found this picture. It's still the main picture on Wikipedia to this day of Harlech Castle. And I thought, oh. And I was even more confused why it wasn't in there. Because honestly, what is prettier than that view? Now, it's not my favorite castle now. I have to admit it. My heart is lost to Beaumaris. That is definitely my favorite of all the castles in this series. But Harlech Castle has a special place for me because as it was built, I cannot imagine a more defensible castle than Harlech as it was built. This is as it is today. As it is today, you cannot see the maritime origins of this castle. It looks all land, but if you look, you can see a lot of flat land not very far away. And here is the point. Because as it was built, there is a reason there is a gate which is called the Waters Gate. And it does have, I would say, not just one row of outer walls, but arguably two. And has multiple fortifications built into around it. It's a very, very strong position. It's a castle which I honestly don't know how it was taken by Owen Gwynair, because look at this castle. Look at the strength of it. Look at the keep, the sheer amount of rock it's built upon. It gets worse as you go on, and as you look at this thing more and more, you are seeing the firing lines. And you honestly don't know how anyone got anywhere near it. But also, as time goes on, you see something beginning to happen. Because you see the sea has got further away, and that's really the weakness for it. Because that's not how it was built to be. It was not built to be a long way from the sea. It was not built for sea levels to recede. It was built to be this. The castle standing proudly on top of a huge, huge mound of rock. Something which was, frankly, a feat of construction to actually build it up there. Literally hewing it from the rock it is built upon. In many respects, you have this. A castle which is built to straight to the sea. That is Harlech. Now, it's not just a random site picked up, because there is mythology about the site of Harlech Castle. It's associated with the legend of Branwen, a Welsh princess. But honestly, there is no evidence for a local fortification to have been built there. And honestly, I can see why. Because it's going to cost a lot of money, take a lot of time, and require a lot of engineering skill. And you have to remember, Edward has a secret weapon. He has James St. George. Now, Edward advances in 1282, and he comes from north from Carnarvon, and westwards from Montgomery and Chester. And during his advance down the Conwy Valley and through Dolan and Castle Yber, he gets Harlech, which is first taken by Sir Otten de Ganson, who is basically in charge of the advance party with 560 troops. It's always listed as infantry, but please note, whenever I've looked it up, infantry is a kind of interesting term. They are mostly seen to be what I would term yeoman archers. Very much professionals. Horses might well have been present. And these are professional soldiers. Yes, they are formally hired as archers, and they probably do fight mostly with archers, but you can guarantee they have long fighting knives, axes, and various other things as well, just in case they end up in infantry close quarters. This wasn't the type of force which, how do I put this? You imagine a heraldic force of this lovely sort of glistening people in armour. No, this was Edward I style advance guard. He put professionals up there, people who knew what they were fighting for, but also knew why they were fighting, and that if they didn't fight well, then they might not have a home to go to, sort of thing. It was a hard life, but they were good at it. Anyway, he manages to get money put in very quickly, Edward I. He managed to get the money paid through very, very quickly. So, initial phase of construction, the money arrives in mid-May 1283. And carpenters and stonemasons arrive in June and July to commence the work. So by the winter of 1283, the first 15 feet of the inner walls have been constructed, and that's height, and allowing the castle to be defended in the event of an attack, and a small planned town have been found alongside the castle. John de Bonvillers was appointed constable of the castle in 1285. But after his death, in 1287, his wife, Agnes, would take up the role until 1290. So there was a female constable of the tower for 3 years. Doesn't really matter, because construction is under the direction of James St. George. And again, the troops that positioned there are mostly professionals, rather than being perhaps a large feudal levy or various knights who might consider other means of advancing. A knight or noble might consider he could get an advancement by forcing a marriage. A paid yeoman's archer would realise that they didn't have necessarily the social standing to be able to get away with such a thing, so they'd be loyal. And especially as if someone came in, they might well decide to replace all those soldiers who'd been loyal to the lady. So it's a case of it serves them well to protect her. In 1286, at the height of construction, the workforce comprised roughly 550 general labourers, about 115 quarriers, 30-ish blacksmiths. There's a debate about that. Wikipedia says 22 carpenters. I've got 25. But I'm reading a different book than Wikipedia is. And roughly 220 to 230 stonemasons. Again, there's a dispute, because some stonemasons refuse to work at certain points. What is agreed is the project was costing nearly £240 a month. A huge amount in those days. Castle is complete by 1289, essentially, and has cost an estimated £8,190. roughly 10% of the 80 grand that Edward spent on castle building in Wales between 1277 and 1304. Which is a rather interesting figure when you think about it, because if we're talking about the Atlantic Wall built by Hitler in World War II, he spends roughly 12% of his budget each on Jersey and Guernsey. Lovely. They barely get Trident, and they barely get anything for that value during World War II, because no one really thinks they're worth the sacrifice to take them back. As much as we love Jersey and as much as we love Guernsey, taking them does not get you France and doesn't get you a second front. Taking France means the Germans on them will probably surrender, in which case you get them back. And it's a lot cheaper that way, because, let's be honest, if they have spent about roughly 25% of their budget on those two islands, they're fairly heavily defended pound for pound. In contrast, Harlech, 10%, but Revolt of Madog ap Llewellyn, affected by that. Revolt of Awen-Gwydir, Wars of the Roses, English Civil War. It takes part in all of these. And during the periods in between, it is critical to enforcing the King's peace, to demonstrating the King's power, to being a statement of the stability of the British state, of the English state, as it was for a while, and then the British state later. This is what Harlech Castle is. What's the point I'm making? Well, Edward I definitely got value for money. And certainly picked a good spot for a castle. Harlech is established with a garrison of 36 soldiers, standard. A constable, 30 men, including 10 crossbowmen, a chaplain, a smith, a carpenter, and a stonemaster. In 1290, Master James, that's James and George, is made the constable of Harlech from 1290 to 93. In 1294, Madog ap Llewellyn began an uprising against English rule, and besieged Harlech along with Crisiff Castle and Aberystwyth Castle over winter. However, fresh supplies were brought over from Ireland by sea. Yes. Again. Let me reiterate this. Fresh supplies are brought over from Ireland by sea. I'm sorry if that's abused anyone's notions here, but yeah. Money talks. They were able to buy supplies from Ireland quite efficiently and quite easily, and get them brought over. Far quicker than bringing them around from anywhere else. It was just a quick hop across the Irish Sea. All do both Aberystwyth and Harlech. As I said earlier, when we're talking about this conquest of Wales, A, it's mostly North Wales. B, it's not just a random conquest. There is reasons for why it happens, and it's to do with stability and what the Welsh princes get up to. C, large number of troops are actually Welsh from southern Wales. And when I say a large number, a majority in both campaigns are southern Welsh. Now, admittedly, southern Welsh is an interesting context because they are often a mix of descendants from Norman settlers who've married into the Welsh population, some Welsh population, and some English settlers who've come later who have then descendants and turn up with soldiers. All that is a factor. Oh yeah, and the Irish keep supplying food for the campaigns. I'm not sure, but I'm also tempted to believe that he had more than a few Scottish knights as well in his army. Does that make Edward a nice guy? No. At no point am I saying Edward I was a nice guy. He was a very effective medieval king. A hard one. He was forged by what had happened in his life before. It made him obsessed, in many ways, with stability, security. His tendencies in these were exacerbated by the fact that his sons, he had many sons, but they kept dying as children or very young. He outlived all but 3 of his sons. The 3 youngest. And in these days, in this period, we're discussing, for a king, having a son was important. It shouldn't be. Let's be honest, especially not these days, but in the period we're talking about, in the 13th and 14th centuries, a son is important because a ruler is measured, in many respects this period, by their ability to dispense wisdom and justice as they are by their ability to smack people over the heads with a large lump of metal. In fact, honestly, that often comes first in perceptions. Because again, being a ruler is about politics. Now, when we're talking about it today, prime ministers have to be seen to be doing things. I've discussed this in previous videos. That is the feature of modern politics. Why? Because of modern media. Modern media is a 24-hour news cycle where the image is as important as what's really happening. So a prime minister might be more effective at managing a crisis, sitting in their office, making decisions, calling people, having meetings. But if they don't go and visit where the crisis is and be seen turning up there, talking to the workers at the site, talking with the locals, travelling all the way there and back, they will be portrayed as uncaring and it'll be used against them. It might be the least efficient use of their time and their role and skills, but it's essential in order for them to maintain the political viability and support they need to win elections and avoid becoming a lame duck prime minister who's seen as already going to lose office, so no one takes any notice of them and they therefore have the power to do nothing. It's the same with a king or a ruler in the medieval period. If they are not heard of as being strong and successful in tournaments, of being a strong, strapping warrior and the battles they fight, especially while they're a prince. Once you're a king, you can be slightly more sensible if you wish to. You've got to be a general as a king. Charging and fighting like the King of Bohemia, Agincourt, or various other battles where various kings do silly things, isn't necessarily appreciated. But while a prince and earning therefore their chops before they become king, they have to be seen to be a warrior. That's how the press will turn it around. And the press of that time is the rumour mill. Yes, you can get tapestries and paintings sort of made of things. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I'm sure, is working away in various other lovely pieces of memorandum. But reality is, the press in the 13th, 14th century is word of mouth. That is another reason why these castles are important. That is why this is magnificent and important. And that is one of the reasons why you have so many castles. Look at this. To walk all the way from Flint Castle to Aberystwyth, going via Rhuddlan, Conwy, Carnarvon and Harlech, is 45 hours. Now, I'd love to do that walk someday. I'm not sure if I would want to do it straight off in one go, or if I want to spread it over a couple of days. I probably, because let's be honest, if I was an army on march, that's what I'd probably spread over a few days. Probably at least 5. Maybe as many as 6 days, if I'm being honest, about how far they probably make it. But the thing is, all those castles on the coast able to be supplied by sea. So you don't have to march all that way. But the thing is, if you consider it's 45 hours walk, how many people own a horse? How many people are involved in those conversations about what a king is? You have no idea. You have no idea how powerful your king is. But it's 45 hours walk, and that is 2, 4, 6 castles. There are others in between, but these are the big Royal Edward I castles. So you might not hear the rumours, you might never see the king, you might not go much further than your own valley in your lifetime, but you'll see that castle. You'll know it has a guard in it. You'll know it's painted, maintained. That will be your impression of the king. That will be the impression of the nation you're part of. That looks strong, doesn't it? That looks powerful. And that's what it was about. Castles are as much about psychological warfare as they are about physical warfare. There'll be a review of a book which will come out soon on this channel, which includes a discussion of Beaumaris Castle. And the point I'll make about it is Beaumaris Castle, it looks like a castle. And that's almost as important as actual attributes as a castle, because that's the point. It's impressive. It's a castle. It might not be the best castle in the world once you start analysing its capabilities, but it's a castle. Harlech is arguably one of the best castles in the world, and still it is mighty impressive to look at. And there's its gatehouse. Even on the side where the land is closest in height to that of Harlech, that is still a big moat. That is still a big gap. That is still not an easy space to get across or climb, and that is not a place I want to go to fight. It is a place I would like to go and visit and wander around. Now, this is episode 12 of 14. Episode 13 of 14 will be Beaumaris, and then it'll be the summary. So I thought now was a good time, especially after all the discussion, to talk about the critical points of a castle in terms of its viability. If you're going to place top trumps with castles, you have to give them scores for geography, structure, and garrison. I would say a garrison of 30 is fairly weak. Even if you do have not a walled town, but a settled town with probably a militia that's going to reinforce you, it's 30 is weak, and I would argue that's one of the reasons why these castles fell. I felt their garrison should easily be double the strength they were. Easily double. Probably more than that. Structure. Structure is it a concentric castle? Does it have how thick are its walls? How high are its walls? How strong is its battlements? Does it have matriculations? Does it have murder holes? Does it have a huge sodding gatehouse that you're not going to get through that easily? And geography. Well, there are 3 types of geography which affect, really, a castle. The location of construction, in terms of, is it a great big hill with rock on it, underneath it? It's high up. How close is it to a easy point of resupply, either a river or the sea? And human geography. Where's the population? It is both existing to impress or suppress, and the human population it draws its garrison from. Those are all factors. It's a beautiful castle, though. It's a proud castle. I know I'm dismissive of some of the castles in this series, and there's probably one you're all not liking my review of. I can say that before I've even recorded that review, because I have 2 castles waiting to record the review of. But this will go up after that one's review has been posted. I can say this honestly. It's my opinion. I'm a naval historian. I teach history of engineering to civil engineers, but still. Go for a wander around Harlech Castle. You won't be disappointed, and imagine it with the sea lapping against the water's gate. Imagine it freshly painted, whitewashed, beautiful white, as you drive up to it. Imagine staring up to it and thinking, that's Edward's castle. The King of England. The most powerful man, the most powerful person on all these isles. You've never seen him, you've never met him, you've heard of him. All you can see are his works, the works of his Magister, Master Mason, James of St. George. Yeah. That's one big, powerful king. Right, what have we got coming up? We have Bruce Ship City 3 on the 11th of July. We have Robert Calder on the 13th and the Battle of Lisa on the 20th. And we have Patrons 28 and 29 announced. 28 is the original cruisers, Royal Navy frigates in the Age of Sail, what they got up to. And Patron 29, Wayne Borean, Coastal Defence Ships. Theory, design, and operation differences between navies. Cool. Thank you for watching. Thank you to everyone who's a patron, who's been funding my research, who has been suggesting topics, currently live as this video goes out for August, who has been voting. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's joined the channel, not just subscribed but also joined the channel. I know at the moment what you get is emojis and responses to questions, to comments, and I will try and work out what else I can do for you in the future once I'm through the point of getting proofed book sorted and edited book of the other book I'm doing with my girlfriend, Falklands Malvinas War. Done. Yes, we are talking about the Falklands Malvinas War because it's going to have veterans of both sides and academics from both sides contributing pieces. Hopefully there's a bit of an issue with one of the veterans, which would make that statement not sort of true, but sorting it out, hopefully. But hence the title, because both sides. And yeah, and by that I mean names of the war. It's kind of like if you were doing a book on the Second World War in Russia, you call it the Great Patriotic War. Yeah, putting all that together takes time, but when it's over, well, I've got the first set of merchandise worked out for various things, and I've got the first set of ideas for other things for this channel. So hopefully it'll be onwards and upwards. And if I eventually get to 40,000 subscribers, as I've said before, I will happily analyze the naval history and design of ships in Warhammer 40k. I feel safe in making this offer at the moment because I've got a little bit over 6,000. If I woke up and I was suddenly jumped up to 40,000, then I'd be panicking because I need to buy some books quite quickly. As it is, I think I can maybe buy a book in about a year's time and buy another book a year after that and just, see how I've got. We can always hope. Anyway, take care, thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed these videos. So far, more to come. 2 more after this one.